Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthologies. Written by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson and narrated by Melissa Del Toro Schaffner. Things that go bump in the night. Travis strode out of the entrance of his tiny frontier home. The cold autumn wind pulled the door tightly shut behind him, slamming loudly. But the thick log walls and sod roof only muffled and did not completely silence Lisbeth's crying from within the one-room structure they called home. Hunkering his shoulders and tucking his neck below the collar of his thick hide coat, he flinched as the bitter night air wriggled his icy fingers deep down into his shirt. Finally reaching up, he clutched his coat at the collar, holding it nearly as tight as he clutched his shotgun with his other hand. Travis didn't believe in all that nonsense that Lisbeth was carrying on about. Her night terrors and ravings about devils or spirits or whatever she called them was just a bunch of superstitious drivel. There was nothing out here in the night but God's own creatures. All her premonitions and imaginings wouldn't get them through the winter if whatever was killing his cattle continued to reduce what had remained of his livestock. Reaching the fence that stretched out from the barn, he leaned on the topmost rail and balanced the shotgun in the crook of his arm, while digging into his pockets for his gloves. Fumbling awkwardly with the thick leather wraps, he worried. Try as he might, he couldn't understand why Lisbeth carried on the way she did. Most of the time she was a good, hard-working, God-fearing woman with a solid grasp of things. But when it got dark and the wind blew, her eyes grew wide and her hands trembled with every noise and creak from their tiny homestead house. Maybe it was her strict Presbyterian upbringing that made her see evil forces and spirits all around her when night fell. Maybe she was just afraid of what she couldn't see, and her fears and imagination made things seem bigger than they really were. Most likely it was because she was getting sicker again. She'd never completely gotten over the bout of consumption she'd had last year, but they couldn't afford the medicine the doctor said she needed. Travis didn't know the reason she was so fearful. In any case, it was something he'd grown used to over the years. Life out here in eastern Colorado was tough enough to break most men. That a woman might cling too tightly to her fears did not seem unreasonable. It was a miracle she'd stayed with him at all. The weather for the past few years had been unusually dry, and all the crops and most of the grass in the nearby pastures had withered away. Their dreams of a flourishing homestead and a farm had blown away in the dust, driven by relentless mountain winds that never ceased. Even the nearby creek had dried up, leaving only a jagged furrow of rock and dirt that marked the ground like an angry, ugly scar. When they'd first arrived here, they'd fancied panning for gold in the stream behind the barn. Old rumors and stories told about how prospectors had managed to gather a significant amount of gold from the stream. Or maybe it had been another stream. Nothing was left now but dust. Water only flowed there when there were heavy rains up in the hills, but scarcely anything was left by the time it reached here. If not for the water pump he'd installed when they first arrived, they'd have died of thirst long ago. Even with that pump, he barely managed to get enough water for his livestock and his horse. There was little left for him and Liz to live on. Certainly not enough to pan for gold. Dreams died hard in the Badlands. Squinting his eyes, Travis peered into the curtain of blackness that stretched away from the farm and strained to hear anything that might be moving in the dark. But try as he might, he couldn't hear anything except the whispering and moaning of the wind as it tugged at dead brush and leaves, pulling them along the ground with cold, invisible hands. Travis figured it was most likely wolves that had been picking off the last of his stock, though he hadn't been able to find any footprints in the cold, hard ground. The only life he'd seen in the past few weeks were insects, large black ones that scurried at the edge of vision, always striving to hide from view. They scared the hell out of Lisbeth. He hadn't seen so much as a rabbit or a gopher in weeks. If there were any wolves around, they'd be starving and desperate, and, he thought, gripping his shotgun tightly, more dangerous than usual. Checking his shotgun to make sure it was loaded, he headed around the back of the barn, where he'd staked out one of his more sickly young cattle as bait. The night deepened, and he rounded the barn as a fast-moving cloud, fleeing through the night, blotted out the nearly full moon that hung high above the horizon. Pausing, he searched for any sign of the calf, but couldn't even see as far as the post he had tied it to. The mangy beast had only been a dozen yards from the back of the barn. He couldn't see anything in the dark. The only thing he could hear was the wind. Earlier, the calf had been braying and bleating loudly as it tugged at the rope that restrained it. The cloud blocking the moon moved on, and the faint moonlight barely lit the flat patch of dirt past the barn. At first, Travis thought he saw the calf lying on the ground, but the dark, unmoving mass seemed oddly shaped. Stepping closer, he raised the barrel of his gun, and the blackness moved abruptly, flowing across the open ground with unnatural speed. As he fired at the shadow, the flash from the shotgun barrel momentarily blinded him. But as the echo of the blast faded, Travis found himself staring at barren ground with no discernible target. Had he just attacked a shadow? He wondered. Had the darkness merely been a fleeing silhouette of passing clouds? Or had something really been there? Approaching the post, he knelt and examined the calf, but there was little left except skin and bones. Literally. Poking at the remains with his shotgun, the calf's hide sagged loosely, but there was no meat or muscle attached to them. It was as if the leather skin of the calf had been removed and replaced after the bones had been stripped bare. Lifting the hide, the bones rattled, but Travis could find no incision or cut to reveal how such a thing had been done. There were no openings except the gaping jaws and the empty eye sockets that stared back at him with unnatural horror. Dropping the strange carcass, Travis lowered his head to the ground and searched for any sign of tracks, but found nothing. Perhaps the wind had already blown them away. The only disturbance to the dirt around the post were the calf's own hoof prints and the pattern of the buckshot about a dozen feet away where he had fired at the fleeting shadow. Noticing something that he had originally thought was a wind-blown leaf, Travis inched forward and picked up a small black sliver. Standing, he held it up and examined it, but it was only the body of an insect, one of those long black things he had seen skittering about the homestead during the past week. Holding it carefully, he stuffed it into the pocket of his coat and glanced back down at the dead calf as he walked slowly back toward the farmhouse. The bitter sting of the wind did not seem as cold as if it had before. Perhaps it was offset by the cold chill that now formed at the base of his spine and rose to the nape of his neck. Without conscious intention, his pace quickened, and he hurried back to the farmhouse where there was light and warmth and strong, thick walls. It was hours later before Travis got a chance to look at the insect he'd brought inside. He hadn't mentioned the calf outside to Lisbeth. She hadn't even heard a gunshot. Shortly after he returned, she stopped crying, and he gently guided her to bed and bundled her in blankets so she could sleep. Her own imagination troubled her dreams enough, and he didn't want to feed them with any worries of his own. Finally, after she at last succumbed to sleep, Travis moved the tiny wooden table where he and Lisbeth shared their meals. There, by the light of the small oil lantern, he retrieved the insect from his coat pocket to look at it more carefully. At first, he looked at it because he was curious, but his interest deepened into puzzlement as he examined his find more closely. It was nothing like he'd ever seen before. Overall, it looked like a large locust, 5 inches long, but the details differed from any insect he had ever seen. The thing was completely black and did not seem to have a front or back. There was no head, and the 2 ends of its cylindrical body seemed identical. Moreover, it had too many legs. He knew spiders had 8 legs and insects had 6, but this one seemed to have 14. 6 were long leg-like appendages, but to either side of those were shorter ones that extended in tiny articulated pinchers or claws. Turning it over, he found openings underneath and feather-like antennae that hinged out away from the body and stretched out to nearly half the insect's length when fully extended. Other details were indiscernible since one of the shotgun pellets had punctured it cleanly in the middle. Other than the hole, however, there seemed little damage. The external shell was unusually pliable and soft. He figured if it had been hard, like a beetle's shell, it would have exploded into pieces. Setting it down, he rubbed his eyes. It had been a long day. He had been up since dawn, searching futilely for any signs of predators that might have been feeding on what was left of his herd. He had only about 10 head of cattle left. Once he had owned more than 50, but most of them had died and they had been forced to eat a few. The bull died earlier that year, and it would be at least 2 years before the male calves were old enough to breed. He had staked out the calf as bait for dinner, but didn't think a wolf or coyote would venture so close to the homestead. He must have been more exhausted than he had realized because he fell asleep while ruminating about his troubles. A nearby noise woke him, and he turned quickly to see several of those black insects on the table by the door. By the light of the tiny lantern, he could see a half a dozen of those bugs posed on top of an open book he had been reading the day before. The insects were perched up on their hind legs, and for the life of him, it looked just like they were studying the book. Perched on their rear legs, they reached out and touched words on the page. Glancing down, he discovered that the creature he'd been studying earlier was gone. Turning back to the insects, they all stood perfectly still on their hind legs, as if they were staring right back at him. He scrambled and reached for the shotgun that lay on the table next to him, but by the time he raised it to aim it at them, the black bugs were gone. Shaking his head, he almost laughed. What was he going to do? Blast a hole in the wall to kill some damn bugs? Yielding to his weariness, he set his gun back down on the table, blew out the lantern, and carefully climbed into bed next to his wife. He didn't bother undressing. He just pulled on one end of the blanket over himself and promptly fell asleep once more. The next morning, Travis rose early like he always did, letting Lisbeth sleep late. He pumped a few buckets of water and carried them to the nearby trough for his cattle and horse to drink. There was a section of fence on the far side of the corral that needed fixing, but instead, he decided to investigate the strange carcass he'd found the night before. However, when he reached a place where he had left it, nothing remained except the stake and the rope. The carcass was gone. He counted the cattle in his small herd and found none of them missing. He couldn't afford to lose any more. Sadly, if their supplies ran much lower, they'd have to spend the last of their money and go into town to buy more food. They might even have to slaughter and eat one of the few cattle that were left. For the 100th time, he debated on giving up the farm and heading back to town. The problem was that they had no money to speak of. He only had a few gold coins and a few coppers. At least here, they had a roof over their head. Maybe he should sell 1 or 2 head of cattle back in town and purchase some supplies. It was more than a full day's travel, but some additional foodstuffs might provide a bit of respite for the two of them. Perhaps he'd discuss it with Lisbeth. Travis headed back to the house, contemplating breakfast. Beef jerky and hardtack was a brutal way to start the day, but it was better than hunger. As his stomach growled, he decided that instead of fixing the fence, he'd spend the day hunting. The damn wolves couldn't have driven off all the game hereabouts, but for hunting, he'd need the rifle, not the shotgun. When he opened the door, it took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the darkened room. But as his vision returned, he stopped, gaping at where his wife slept. For sitting on her pillow, just next to her face, were 3 of those damned black bugs. They seemed to be studying her, the way the others had been examining that open book the night before. Then, one of the insects shifted so that it appeared to be staring at him. Travis crept slowly towards his wife. He didn't want to startle the creature and have it sting her or something. However, before he could get close, all the bugs opened their feather-like wings and gracefully flew across the room, disappearing through a crack at the ceiling that he had been meaning to patch. It was then that he noticed the pouch where he kept the little money they possessed lay on the floor. The gold and copper coins were scattered on the floor. Picking up the pouch, he saw that the thread on the seams had been chewed away. Swearing under his breath, he picked up the coins and put them in his pocket. Then he knelt down and gently woke his wife. She rose and performed her morning ablutions. Then he told her that he planned to go hunting for the day. When she asked, he told her the calf had been taken the night before, without any details about the strange carcass he had found. Neither did he mention his encounters with the black bugs just moments before. Instead, he prepared their austere meal and talked about whether they should sell some cattle in town. When he had finished eating, he packed up the gear he'd need for the day, kissed his wife, and went out to saddle his horse. He went into the barn and fed and watered his horse Sarah. Then he slowly saddled her and climbed up on top of her, walking her out of the barn. While focusing on where he should look for game, he didn't expect any more strange events, but he pulled his horse up short when he exited the barn. The ground outside was covered with the black creatures. He had never seen so many insects at a single time. There were thousands of them. They moved and skidded across the ground. Indeed, it seemed the very ground was alive. He inched Sarah forward, but she balked and backed away from the undulating mass of black bugs. Then, something truly unexpected occurred. Almost all the bugs fled and scattered away to one side, but a few remained. Travis sat slack-jawed and nearly paralyzed as he realized that the remaining insects were grouped so that they spelled out 2 words on the ground. In letters nearly 3 feet in size, they read, "Help me." He shook his head in disbelief and watched as the insects moved and reformed on the dirt before him. This time, they spelled out the word, "Please." Travis reached down and pinched himself, half convinced that he was sleeping. But before he could act or react, the bugs moved once more. They all gathered in one writhing mass of blackness, and climbing up on top and over one another, they formed a mound that grew in size. In a matter of seconds, the mound rose up like something growing up from the ground, and unexpectedly, they stopped, forming the shape of a tall man dressed in a long trench coat, just like the one Travis wore. The black figure was featureless, with no face, eyes, or mouth. It seemed nothing more like a black shadow standing in the morning light. Slowly, it raised an arm and pointed toward the dry creek beyond the barn. Travis looked in that direction and then turned back toward the figure in black. Perhaps Lisbeth was right, and there were demons after all. Then the form collapsed and became a writhing mass of black bugs on the ground. Once more, the bugs lined up and formed the 3 words in bold black letters across the ground. "Please, help me." Then they scattered again and moved en masse toward the creek bed. After they disappeared from view, Travis considered his options. He could follow them or hurry inside to see if Lisbeth was all right. More than anything else, he just wanted to kick Sarah into a full gallop and get away from here as fast as he could. But no, he couldn't leave Sarah, and upon reflection, he decided that even if the bugs were demonic in nature, they sure were polite. Tentatively nudging Sarah forward, he rounded the corner of the barn and saw, perhaps 100 feet away, the mass of black creatures waiting for him. As he came into view, they all scurried away, stopping another 100 feet toward the creek. "They're leading me somewhere," thought Travis. He reached down and touched a rifle next to him before realizing that it would be useless against the insects. There was no way he'd ever be able to kill them, one shot at a time. He then regretted that he hadn't brought his shotgun. Fighting back the desire to flee, he wondered where they were taking him and slowly followed them further from the homestead. The slow progression of bugs leading Travis lasted for about 15 minutes, taking him about a quarter-mile upstream along the dried-up stream bed. It was then that he stopped to study what it was they had brought him to. There, on one side of the gully, was a metal object. It was disc-shaped, like a flattened sphere. It was larger than a wagon, and it rested on the ground. Moreover, it was shiny, as if it had been polished, though now it was covered in dust and dirt. Indeed, it was half buried. It looked like it had managed to position itself near the side of the creek, though Travis could see no wheel tracks suggesting how it might have gotten there. It was obvious what the problem was. The high bank next to the thing had collapsed, half burying it in dirt and stone and trapping it there. More than a ton of gravel and rock lay across the top of the object. The largest rock looked to be maybe half a ton in size. The bugs scampered and crawled all over the metal object. After a few minutes, they gathered together once more and reformed again into the shape of a man in black. As before, the figure once again raised an arm and pointed at the metal device. Travis thought for a moment and slowly nodded that he understood. The figure nodded back, and its form collapsed back into a shapeless, gigantic pile of black creatures. Then they all scattered away. In less than a minute, they were all gone. Not a single of the creatures remained in sight. Travis waited another minute before turning his horse and heading back to the barn. Dismounting, he hitched Sarah to a fence post and gathered some tools. He took a long length of strong rope, a shovel, a pick, and a long metal pole that he could use as a pry bar to move those big rocks. When he had everything he needed, he mounted his horse and headed back to the creek. When he arrived, only a few bugs were visible, a small assembly of the winged insects, a tiny contingent of perhaps a dozen bugs that stood, as if they had been waiting for him. Then they too vanished. Travis dismounted Sarah once more and got to work. It wasn't easy. His efforts to remove the debris burying the object took him more than half a day. He'd been able to remove most of the rock using a pick and shovel, but he had to use the rope with Sarah pulling on it as he worked with the metal pry bar for leverage to move the large boulders that trapped the metal contraption. When he was done, he leaned on the pole, wiping sweat from his brow. The insects scurried over the object, inspecting it and surveying Travis' work. Then they all disappeared unceremoniously into the object through tiny holes at its edge that Travis hadn't noticed before. He waited, but all the insects had disappeared and none reemerged. Shaking his head, Travis wondered what he had been thinking of. The entire morning and part of the afternoon had passed, and he had nothing to show for it except sweat, dirty hands, and a sore back. But that was the way things were out here on the frontier. Neighbors helped neighbors and expected nothing in return. Packing up his tools, he led Sarah back to the barn where he put everything away and brushed Sarah down. He poured out an extra portion of feed for her and topped off the horse trough with fresh water. Then, returning to their small one-room house, he ate lunch with Lisbeth, telling her that he hadn't found any game or any of the wolves and that he'd wasted the entire day. He didn't tell her how he'd really spent the morning. After lunch, he fed and watered the cattle and completed his other daily chores. Then, exhausted from his labors, he fell asleep, despite the fact that it was still light outside. He slept undisturbed, in the soundest of slumbers, and had the strangest dreams. At least until he woke to the sound of Lisbeth screaming at the top of her lungs. He struggled to orient himself and determine what she was yelling about, finding that she was standing on a chair pointing at the open door. There, in the center of the doorway, standing on its hind legs, was the largest bug Travis had ever seen. It was at least a foot in length, and it waited patiently as if it were a dinner guest waiting to be invited in. Travis approached, uncertain what to do, but the insect dropped to the ground and skittered about 10 feet away before standing up once more, as if waiting for him. I'm being led somewhere again, he thought. Grabbing his hat and the small lantern by the door, he followed the strange bug, leaving Lisbeth behind without any explanation. This time, he didn't take his horse, since he figured where he was going. As he had expected, the single bug led him back to the metal object where he had worked most of the day. The object, however, now gleamed like a polished mirror, clearly reflecting the moon, stars, and his tiny lantern. The bug he had been following ran up to the top of a small mound of leaves and chittered loudly at him. It was the first sound that he had ever heard any of them make. Then, bugs flowed out of the object and swarmed around the mound, joining in and gathering together to spell out 2 words for him to read. They said, "Thank you." Travis shook his head in disbelief. Then the bugs scattered and disappeared one last time, vanishing into the object. Travis was beginning to think he was dreaming again, but was jolted and surprised when the metal object started to hum. Taking a couple steps backwards, he watched as the object lifted itself off the ground, as if by magic, and slowly rose into the air. After hovering for a moment, it climbed higher into the sky and then suddenly accelerated and disappeared into the night. After the metal saucer flew away, Travis found himself standing alone in the moonlight with a mound of leaves at his feet. He started to leave, but noticed that the mound of leaves was out of place. There weren't any other leaves nearby. Kneeling, he cautiously inspected the leaves and found that they covered a small pile of gravel. Looking at them more closely, he realized the tiny pieces of gravel didn't look like the surrounding stone. They glistened in the light of his lantern, and he picked one up, holding it close to examine. His eyes grew wide when he realized what the tiny stones were. Gold. He took off his hat and started to pile the pebbles and nuggets into it. Then he realized that the yellow sand beneath the stone was dust. Gold dust. His hat grew heavy as he scooped the precious treasure into it. By the time he was satisfied that he had gathered all the gold, he estimated that he had more than 2 pounds of the yellow metal. It was a fortune. These creatures had gathered this. Each nugget and pebble, each grain of gold dust had been collected by thousands of tiny hands. They were paying him back for his help. But how could they have known? It didn't matter, he thought. With this, he'd be able to buy new livestock and supplies. He'd be able to fix up the farm and even hire some hands to help. Then he paused. No. First, he'd take Lisbeth into town and get that medicine she'd been taking before. If need be, he'd take her to Cheyenne to get the best doctors there to care for her. He could afford it now. Standing, he slowly walked back to the house and wondered what he was going to tell her. Considering everything that had happened, he didn't even know where to start. She wasn't going to believe anything he said. By the time he got home, he decided to tell her that he just found a hidden stash of gold that previous prospectors had gathered and hoarded. There was no sense telling stories that no one would believe. It's a new season, and we have some new authors and new storylines that will absolutely delight you. And as you know, we absolutely love our listeners, fans, and patrons. If you loved what you heard, consider joining us over on Patreon. That's where all the fun happens. Just visit www.patreon.com/Melissa Del Toro voiceover. If you'd like to read more of the stories in the Untold Tales series, not narrated here on our podcast, you can find Jeff's books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. The links for all of this information are conveniently listed in this episode's show notes. Thank you and have a wonderful day.